Okay, here we go. I'm ready. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Hello. Welcome, Josh and Cherie. Huge pleasure to have you both on the show.
Thanks for
Thanks
having
for
us.
having us. Yeah.
So maybe first question, just to introduce you to the audience. Josh, founder of Criteria. Cherie is the CEO of Revelian in Australia, and Criteria bought Revelian in February this year. So Josh, in the evolution of your business, you've got a Harvard PhD, your business has been going since 2000. What led you to, as an American organization, to buy an Aussie entity?
Yeah, great question. So we've long sort of had our eye on Revelian, I would say. And one of the things that we loved about them is that they had such a great history of innovation, and specifically that they've innovated in the area of game-based assessments. And, we've been in the assessment market in the US in terms of working with companies to help make more data-driven, evidence-based decisions for quite some time. And one of the big trends we saw in the last 4 or 5 years, I would say, is there's a big emphasis among employers on candidate experience. And we realized at Criteria that not everyone loves assessments as much as we do. And so one of the ways to make the whole process of being assessed more enjoyable and more engaging is to measure some of those same constructs that you're measuring through traditional assessments through game-based formats. And that's something that Revelian's really been the leader in for the last, I would say, 5 or 6 years. So that was how they came onto our radar. And specifically, I know the topic of today was emotional intelligence. They have a great game-based assessment of emotional intelligence that we were very interested in, called Emotify. So that's what started the dialogue between Cherie and myself, and it's been great so far. It's been a little bit of a strange environment to get to know another company. I was hoping to have spent a lot more time in Australia by now, but it's been great so far, even if it's been mostly remote.
Well, let's start with that. I mean, what is the most demonstrable impact, Cherie, of COVID on, not on the business commercially, but on the thinking of your clients, corporations, and how to manage workforces, and whether we ever actually do go back to full-time working in office environments again, because that's going to have a huge impact on people's mental health, on their, also on maybe measurement tools as well, because they're going to perform differently at home as to they will do in an office environment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, COVID took us all with gusto and unexpected impact. And I think there was 2 main variables that organizations are really finding they have to adjust to. One is the fact that some of the trends we were talking about likely to change in workforce structures around being more flexible, more diverse workforces, more geographically dispersed workforces, happened overnight, and organizations had to turn on a dime to respond to that rather than ease into it. And the second is we've been talking about agile principles and the ability for our workforce to adapt to change really organically, and trying to build that into our systems and processes in an organic fashion. And again, it was kind of overnight, people had to instantly respond to that. And for me, that's really at the heart of what we do in assessing people and finding them for the best fit. Some of the core predictors of success as an individual employee is how well we can problem solve. How well can we automatically take all the new information and find a solution. And that's one of the core things that every individual within an organization and the organization as an entire entity had to do very, very quickly. So our clients are giving us feedback that now that they're working with people in a combination or entirely remote and in the office, they're now having to look at new systems of communication, new methods of connection, new methods of engagement. How do they really ensure someone's effective and productive in their roles? And they're evaluating everything about their organization and the individual in a different manner. So getting data to measure that is more important than ever.
Well, also it's about getting accurate data, because I was talking to someone last night about how we gather that data. And if you're asking them to fill out a form, what's your emotional health, what you feel, how you're productive, and this is anonymized, would you really want to give that form back up to your manager? Depends on your relationship with them. If you have a very transparent relationship, yes. But if you feel that you're being harassed or bullied at work in your own perception of what that is, then you're highly unlikely to be transparent and honest with the provision of that data.
Yeah, I think what you're talking to there is how important it is for whatever your project or survey is or assessment that you're setting up, how important the design of that is to ensure you're getting a valid outcome. And whether you're looking at a measure of current engagement within a employee base through a survey, or whether you're looking at, you know, an assessment, it's the same consideration. You've got to look at who is the audience you're trying to assess, what's the context in which this information will be used, how do you get the most valid data from that experience. And I think when you're now looking at a more diverse remote workforce, people are more dependent on that survey or feedback loop to get that accurate measure. So more and more they're looking for tools, independent third-party providers to provide that support that gives that confidentiality or confidence in the data collection to make sure that they really can hold confidence in the data.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's one of those things. It's the more data you get, hopefully, you can analyze which are the weak points. But one of the things which I'm very curious about for both of you, and maybe Josh, is I work with a fair amount of people, or have worked with a fair amount of people and continue to, who are what is now called being on the spectrum. You know, the spectrum is broad. Everything is now in the spectrum. There's no separate diagnosis. And many of these people will perceive difference simply because of a diagnosis. And when I talk to them, I say, well, actually, you know, I'm a pretty skilled interviewer. I've been a lawyer. I know how to talk to people, and I know I know which questions to ask. But most people would have no idea, and they would see you as being perfectly fitting within the norm of what the workforce is like. But we know that they are challenged by these type of questions simply because they don't feel they fit into that construct. And we also know, and you can both talk to this, that creating a diverse workforce means engaging with people from every field. Because if we just have one same clone of each other, there's no evolution. So how do we bring in assessments and games for people who are, say, within the spectrum, who see the world and see problem solving very differently, but can be alienated by a workforce?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And it's one that we think about a lot, because one of our big emphases is reducing bias in the selection process. And that takes many forms, but it's particularly challenging when you're talking about, you know, non-neurotypicals, right? So it's specifically, it depends a lot on the types of assessments here, because what we find with people on the spectrum is that often they will perform very well on cognitive ability tests, right? Where they'll do better than more neurotypical folks on those types of assessments. But that sometimes personality-based assessments can be very discriminatory, in short, against those types of populations. So we always work with our clients to sort of craft the appropriate types of assessments to use based on a given role. And often when a company is assessing populations that they know have that characteristic, they'll do various accommodations, like they won't sometimes give a personality test. But there's so much embedded in the hiring process, at least here in the US, that is not friendly to autistic individuals. For example, interviews, right? Interviews are terrible for that population in terms of the impact they have. So things like cognitive ability tests can actually screen in people who might have otherwise not been noticed from those types of populations. But other types of assessments, and I think personality and probably EI as well would be things there that you'd have to be very careful with. So it's a great question. It's definitely something that you need to think about.
If you had a client who is going through this process, and so we take like an example of someone who is flagged as being on the spectrum in that in the cognitive test, can we then create an environment where we can say to an employer, look, if you put this person through a typical interview with someone who is not very well trained, because people are not trained on people who are in that very high executive function, but their personality traits are very different. They're just going to see them as flat and cold. There's going to be no eye contact. It's going to be a very disengaged interview. But if you put them in with someone else from a similar type, or who was just asking them highly technical questions, which they would excel at, then of course that candidate would be, at the top of the list. But then you've got the issue of others saying, well, then you disenfranchise everybody else. But it's not really about that. It's hiring the right person for the right fit, for the right job, not putting everyone into the mix for that. And I think that's a sea change in how they can assess the hiring process. And when I was a headhunter for 15 years, and some of the hiring processes out there are really not very supportive at all.
Mm-hmm.
That's so true. And I think, at the end of the day, what you're describing there is, conscious and unconscious bias in the recruitment process that we can actually have across the whole variety of steps. And at the moment, it's a pretty hot topic around inclusion and diversity, and making sure that we're managing any variant of subpopulation in a fair and equitable way to achieve what you said, the best person for the role, irrespective of any of their particular demographics or personal circumstances. So I think when we try and look at recruitment as a whole process, it's trying to reduce that bias across every single step. And unfortunately, interviews is one where we see most bias, because we actually all come with our own predetermined subconscious and conscious expectations. And we also know, from a behavioural personality perspective, we actually are more attracted to people that are more similar to ourselves. So it's really natural that if I was the interviewer, someone who mirrored my style of communication, my preferences, is more likely to rank higher from myself, which is why lots of people have a panel interview to try and build in a variety of perspectives to try and get a little more balanced perspective. It also becomes really important to have a structured interview. And one of the things we're seeing clients do more and more is actually not only have a structured interview, but when they're doing assessments earlier up in the funnel in the recruitment process as a strong, less biased method of shortlisting, using some of the content from the responses or the results from those individual reports from the assessments to drive interview questions. So you can have a more structured, less biased approach to evaluating that person's potential suitability.
And one of the things we're seeing more and more of, and this came through the sort of graduate entry scheme, is I call them bot-based video interviews, which I'm sure you're familiar with. In America, you'd be very familiar. Cherie, I'm sure you see this in your world as well. And I'm now seeing them creeping into executive level as well. And again, highly discriminatory if you're on the spectrum, because you're sitting in front of a video, answering a question in, you've got 40 seconds to read it, you've got 3 minutes to answer it, and it'll move to the next one and move to the next one, move to the next one. There's no room for editing or, where do you see those within your business, and where do you see the benefits, and how can we tweak them because it appears to, particularly for high volume, maybe not senior executive roles, because we can have a face-to-face, but in volume recruitment, the screening process, how do we bring that into a business and make it, I suppose, remove those biases?
Yeah.
Josh, maybe? Yeah.
It's a great question. So, one of the things we've seen in COVID especially is like video interviewing is taking off, right? Because obviously in-person interviewing is a lot tougher to do. And so on a surface level, right, video interviewing, especially, further up in the funnel, as Cherie mentioned, can be a great substitute for in-person interviews. It's efficient, relatively efficient for both the interviewer and the interviewee. So it's as a replacement for the in-person interview, it's got a lot of benefits. I think, and a lot of our customers are doing more interviewing now than they were six months ago, more video interviewing. Where we kind of part paths with some video interviewers, interviewing technologies take that approach you described, Ed, which is problematic, I think, for a couple of reasons. One is it's so opaque, right? So they're using AI in different ways, and you don't know exactly how the AI is being used, and often it has unintentional discriminatory effects.
It's got bias anyway.
It's got tons of bias built in, absolutely. And what's more problematic for me is that the applicant has no idea what they're being assessed on, right? So you talk to applicants and they know there's some sort of algorithm behind the product, but they don't know if they're supposed to smile a lot or use big words or have certain facial expressions. So it's really a quagmire in terms of both ethically and just from an effectiveness standpoint. On the other hand, straightforward video interviewing can be a great relief to both applicants and recruiters, because it can save a lot of time. So where we stand on that is, we feel like from an ethical standpoint, candidates should always know what they're being assessed on and not have to be sort of guessing on that. So in our game-based emotional intelligence assessment, for example, they're seeing different faces and reacting to what the emotions are that are being expressed. So there's no mystery there. The applicant knows, okay, they're measuring how emotionally intelligent I am. Or on a cognitive ability test, they would know, okay, they're measuring my problem solving. And when the applicant doesn't know what's being assessed, that's where I think you have a larger problem. And that's the case with some of these video interviewing technologies and platforms that use black box algorithms that can be quite problematic.
Well, I think also one of the potential uses of AI, and I'm sure it's going to come at some stage, is the ability to be fed questions through an earpiece using AI during an in-person interview. So you can take all the data and say, well, this is the way it's going. You need to ask this question because what happens in interviews, I've interviewed tens of thousands of people as an employer and also as a headhunter in many different businesses. But what we see is the power of the questions becomes quite weak when you've made that cognitive bias towards the person you want to hire or the bias towards the person you don't want to hire. So I'll see C-suite who are taking a very senior, very highly paid role, and they're out on their ears 6 months later because that little red flag of intuition is kicking in. They're not asking the question because it's too easy. And similarly, the interviewing panel doesn't ask the question either because it just looks good. So there is potential for technology to train the interviewer. So, okay, well, this is where you're at, but you still need to ask these questions. And I don't see how, perhaps you can expand on how you can bring this in either through gaming by getting them to do something afterwards or through the interviews themselves. But I think there's so much bias in the hiring process. We've got to try and equalize that somehow.
Yeah, there's no doubt some of this technology is exciting and there's some great innovation happening, but we've got to make sure that we're not just following bells and whistles for the sake of something new and exciting, and we're really remaining true to, I think, this core of, it's got to be data science led, it's got to be valid, we've got to be able to demonstrate the evidence that whatever it is that we're using is actually predicting a solid workplace outcome. So for example, if you've got AI built into any of your methods in recruitment, how you're training the AI to respond is make or break in terms of bias. So it's not as easy to say all AI is the same, because there can be massive variations on how this is deployed. We use some really sophisticated innovation and technology on the way that we look at creating new items or questions for our assessments and our game-based tools. And the anchor on what we're training the AI on is around robust scientific evidence or psychometric properties around which types of questions are most effective in predicting workplace emotional intelligence or on-job performance across a diverse non-biased population, versus if you're using it against a reference point that is created around a profile of what you think you want, not based on any data or actual leverage of what the population is looking for. There can be some real challenges in putting that into place. And I actually think that the legal context in which we run recruitment is starting to catch up with this. I think that our governance is starting to pay a bit more attention to say, yeah, it's really good that we can have this new interesting methods in recruitment, but let's make sure we're not discriminating inappropriately. So there's been a couple of cases globally where legislation is starting to put a firmer position around how these tools can be used. And even within Australia, we've got some really good governance in terms of some of our government policies specify that any government agency has to use a multifaceted recruitment process. And there are particular steps in that process that have to be established in addition to others. So, recruitment is never one step. And it's important that we understand there's just because we're human going to be some bias in any individual step, but you've got to look at the whole process together. And for every stage that you're running, making sure that you're putting, you know, the best of breed tool in place, that it is something you can back up legally and ethically to say, this is the tool that's going to be sound and fair and appropriate for all stakeholders. And that gives you confidence in who you're bringing into the business as well.
And then unfortunately, you have, sorry, Josh, you have human beings. And I've certainly witnessed many occurrences where the protocols have been thrown out the window because they really like the person.
Right. Well, there's so much, you know, you talked about it earlier, Ed, but there's so much evidence that shows, and Cherie touched on this as well, that subjectivity plays such a huge role in interviews. So that, you know, you hear these terrifying statistics about, you know, 30 to 40% of interviewers have made up their mind on a candidate within the first 5 minutes of the interview, right? And that is not an evidence-based approach. It's based, as Cherie alluded to, on sort of how well they hit it off or what they initially had in common. And that's sort of, in the US, we call that the would I like to have a beer with this person test, but that shouldn't be how we're making hiring decisions, right? So, you know, you need to be really careful. And the truth is, in the US here, there's also been a lot of focus on bias in AI. But the truth of it is there's bias in so many parts of the hiring process, you know, unconscious bias or other. And so really you got to be focused on, while not taking the human element out of it at all, you've got to be focused on doing things to reduce the impact of unconscious bias, which we all have, right? The research shows. So, you know, and it's a series of steps at every step of the recruitment process, as Cherie was mentioning.
And so what do we do about what I'm beginning to see, and I'm not sure where this is in the US, but I do a lot of work over there as well. Most of my work over there is the interview length is decreasing and decreasing and decreasing. So as when I was a headhunter, and I haven't done that for 10 years or so, but I used to have a rule that no interview would last less than 45 minutes, unless clearly it was a sales role and they've got no sales experience, in which case it's thank you, see you later. Because most people, you know, you put the script down, face down. I just want to talk to them. I don't want to have the pre-rehearsed script that they've come up with to impress me, because I'm not interested in that, because it's a script. I want to actually talk to this person. And they generally, particularly the ones who say are more marginally on the spectrum, don't open up until a long way into the interview process. But what we're seeing is 20, 30-minute interviews. And I don't see how you can make an effective hiring decision on such a short interview, even if there are 10 of those in the process. I don't know what the data is on that and what you're seeing.
One of the trends we've seen further accelerated, particularly with COVID, but definitely was well established before that, is organizations are now using, you know, assessments in recruitment is pretty standard practice today for most established organizations. And what I'm seeing is that they're using it earlier in the process. And part of the purpose for that is so that they can then actually have greater confidence in their shortlisting as to who comes to interview and spend more quality time with them. So for example, if you're using a battery of assessments, really at the top of the funnel, you might be capturing an application form, scoring that, and really only screening out on must-haves, you know, if it's a visa or a particular, you know, license to drive something in particular, or a particular qualification that's needed. And that's about it. Everyone else is moving through to the assessment phase. If you're using quality assessments, then that's one of the least biased processes you can use to determine someone's potential suitability. Once you've then shortlisted from there and you come into the interview phase, you can have greater confidence if you've applied the thresholds of shortlisting on those assessments confidently, that any that you pick from this from the interview round is going to meet your core criteria to perform well in the job. So then what happens is you can spend more involved time with that individual to unpack their preferences, their style, their fit to the team dynamic in which they're going to actually to sit. And it gives you more confidence that you can invest that time. If you were doing interviews earlier in the funnel, from a logistical and a practical perspective, you simply can't spend an hour on you know, every candidate. So that slight shuffle in the process, and remotely, you know, now we're often doing not only recruitment, but onboarding in a remote environment. And we have to bring people through a process where they may not be meeting us face to face at all. So in that circumstance, being able to shortlist through to an interview, and the interview still may be in technology, we can have more confidence on who we're bringing in because we've got such a good insight to this person. You know, it's a little bit like we used to say, you know, when you're buying a car, if you're buying a secondhand car, you get a roadworthy. You have a look under the hood. You get to know what this car really is like, not just what the paint looks like and how shiny the wheels are, but you've got to actually look at the substance of the vehicle. It's the same as people when we're recruiting them. We want to look at the core person. What are the attributes this person will bring to the job, and how suitable is that for what I need? And making a hiring decision based on that, rather than just the paint job or the shiny wheels we see turn up in an interview, is a much more valid approach.
But the analogy is similar to criteria buying Revelian or Josh buying Cherie, in the sense if I asked you, how many hours of conversations did you have before you both agreed to the deal? What would it be? It's going to be, you know,
a lot.
Like, I mean, you've probably known each other for a long time, but it's, you know, it could be, you know, 20, 30, 40, 50, it could be 100 hours of total time. There's a lot of time in there, right? In a highly important decision. But I think what we're seeing is potentially is what you're talking about, Cherie, and we're talking about maybe hiring people at a lower level, but this system and structure is creeping into C-suite and executive level hiring, where I still don't believe you can hire someone into an executive function off a 20-minute interview, regardless of how many assessments you've done. So I think they're beginning to apply the dynamic of, you know, middle tier interviews and lower tier interviews to the top, and that fundamentally doesn't work.
Yeah, I think what my reaction to that would be that if a company is having 30-minute interviews or 20-minute interviews as a standard, they've probably built that model because too many of their interviews don't work, right? And so they want to be done with them quickly, right? And so I think Cherie's point is, you know, one of the value adds of assessments is they can really cut down on the number of awful interviews that you have to do, where both sides know it's, you know, not a fit pretty early on. And so fewer wasted interview hours should be the expectation from assessments, especially if you're using them sort of at the top of the funnel. And if you do that right, then you can afford to have longer interviews, because there won't be a bunch of interviews where the fit is just obviously off. So that gives you the luxury of longer interviews. And the second point I would make is you're absolutely right, Ed, on like, I think the reason that no one or very few people, very few companies do structured interviews is exactly what you said. It doesn't feel organic. It doesn't feel natural. It feels like scripted and kind of awful. But all the evidence suggests they work better, and it's because they're structured more as an objective assessment, right, where everyone gets the chance to answer the same questions and be graded along a common rubric. And I've actually found that during COVID, when, you know, all of the interviewing I've done over COVID has been remote, and it actually makes it a little bit easier to do a structured interview, because you can sort of have your notes beside you, and it's not like you're, you know, in the room with the person, and it's kind of awkward if you're reading off a list, right? So I've actually found it's been a good environment for doing structured interviews, because at our company at Criteria, even though we know what the data says that structured interviews work much better, they're much more accurate predictors, we still often don't do structured interviews because they just don't feel like welcoming to the applicant. So I
think that's the other thing, is that you risk marginalizing the applicant. So you can have someone you want to hire and they go through the process and they just think it's so impersonal that I don't really want to work there anyway. So whilst you might get a higher productivity and engagement from your employee if they accept the job, what is your rate of failure of actually getting the talent that you want into the company? I don't know if you have data on that.
Well, it's from a recruitment marketing perspective. It's like, yeah, in an interview, they're selling you, and you're also selling your company as the employer. So I think that's right. I don't have data around it, but I feel like that's one of my roles in interviews, is to sell them on the opportunity as well. Right. And you're right, if you're doing it in a sort of artificial or stilted kind of way, scripted kind of way, it can have the opposite effect.
Well, I think it's Cherie, probably going to be, is it not a combination? So you can introduce the candidate and say, look, it's a 6-phase interview process. Like, we're going to pre-screen you. We're going to give you some assessments. You're going to have a structured interview. but you will also have the opportunity to talk to another human being about things that humans talk about. So, so please, this is the first 4 phases of the process. Once we've got through that, then we want to know about you, and we'll tell you all about our company. But you've got to let them know that's going to happen. Otherwise, they go, well, I just don't want to carry on.
Yeah, there's no doubt. Look, candidate experience is critical. That's one of the #1 factors that our clients are looking for across their full recruitment process, both to attract and retain the candidates through the process, because it's competitive to get the great talent out there. So absolutely, we need to be clear in informing candidates proactively about what are the steps you're going to walk through. We also need to move them quickly through the process. And that's again why we're finding, many organizations are kind of front loading or top loading their process and their evaluation methods, so that people are moving immediately from application form through assessments, maybe a video interview, and could be in front of a person at that step you're talking about, in days, very, very quickly. And at each step, they're getting feedback. And at each step, it's really engaging, and it's an interaction that they're actually getting some value back from themselves. So by the time that they get to meet and greet and speak to a human in a lot more depth, then they've been qualified so much that there's real confidence that this person is a really strong potential candidate, and they can have a more meaningful conversation from both parties' perspective. And then that enhances the interview experience and obviously enhances the entire recruitment process. Many of our organizations that we work with talk to, I think, Josh, you were mentioning this, the fact that their recruitment campaigns are one of the largest marketing campaigns they run. It's really the first interaction with the brand. It represents expectations of what the employees are likely to have. So managing that pool of people is critical. What else do the organizations run whereby you'll have any particular recruitment drive, 99% of the candidates are going to be rejected. And yet you want those people to walk away with a positive experience, talking highly of you, either buying or referring you to other people. That's a tricky ask, right? And it's about them personally.
Well, I think it's more than a tricky ask. I think we can talk objectively about the things we would like to see in the process. But the more and more and more we hear is of candidates being ghosted through the process, even ghosted post-interview, even ghosted post-final interview. And you talk about feedback, but there is none. There's no feedback at all. It's just an email. Thanks very much. Or if you're lucky, you get an email. So what can Criteria and Revelian, I don't know if it's even your world, do to help your clients and people understand that if you've been through an assessment process, you've been through this process, there must be some information that we can feed back based on that, which can even be automated, which is, by the way, these are your assessment results. You weren't a fit for us, but I thought it would be useful for you to know what the results said. And that can be automated. You can use AI, simple AI, just to do that. And then at least that creates some form of engagement, as opposed to literally turn up for the interview, never hear from them again, because the feedback from them is only ever going to be incredibly negative.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. I think, well, I'll let Cherie speak to this. Revelian's ahead of Criteria on this front, but I think, the emphasis in the US is, just like in Australia, really strongly on the side of candidate experience for the reasons that Cherie mentioned. And so Revelian does this for most of their assessments. We do it for some of ours, is to give feedback to candidates. So we do it in the US, it's most commonly done for personality assessments. So when you take a personality assessment, and as Cherie mentioned, most people don't end up getting the jobs. There's so many applicants for each role these days, that, if the employer has chosen to share this feedback, which a lot of them do, they get a few page written report on sort of some of the things the assessment learned about them. And it's written from a growth and development perspective, not as much from a selection perspective. It doesn't say this is why you did or didn't get the job, because there's a lot of factors there besides the assessment, obviously, right? But it does hopefully give them some points to react to, some growth and development suggestions. And I think Revelian actually has that for most of their assessments. They provide some kind of feedback, and it's really what Cherie mentioned. It's important for the employer brand, right? If you're applying to Coke or Pepsi or some other big consumer goods company, right? They want all the people who didn't get the job to still drink their product at the end of the recruitment process and be have a warm and fuzzy feeling about it. So, so providing this kind of feedback, which I think was pretty unheard of maybe 10 or 15 years ago in assessments, is now more and more common. And so we've actually learned from Revelian, are doing more of it on more of our different assessments. In the US, there's some employers have a little bit of a concern about around litigious reasons for providing that feedback or not. But so it's more commonly done in Australia, but it's definitely something that we're starting to do more of if the employer, opts to choose that setting.
Well, presumably the candidate can sign a waiver anyway. So like, if you want this, we're indemnifying ourselves against any future claim. If you don't want it, that's fair enough.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And I think the candidate experience is such a core priority. We really, at both Cherie and Revelian, consider that we've got two client groups. We've got the organisation who's engaging us to use assessments as part of their recruitment process, but the candidate pool is our client as well. So we need to ensure that they're getting the same sort of service level, feedback, engagement with our experience as we give to a client. So the candidate pool, we're constantly evaluating their feedback around what was the experience like in actually completing the assessments or the game-based assessments. They absolutely get a proactive feedback report immediately they complete their assessment about how did they go, what was their experience like. And we also offer them an opportunity sometimes to be involved in different research projects and other different activities to stay connected and engaged with shaping how things are moving forward in our broader industry. And across the board, we've had such positive feedback from candidates that have unfortunately said, what a delight to get a feedback report and some feedback. Yeah. It's a shame, it's a novelty, but also around the particular experience of doing, the game-based assessments. Consistently, they're talking about how this is such a positive step forward from the more, 20 years ago, those quite intimidating, long assessments that people had to do. As Josh mentioned, at Cherie and Revelian, we love assessments, but we recognise that might not be what the general population's reaction to doing a test is.
They don't. I mean, the reality is, here am I, I've been coaching people for 25 years or so around the world. I hate assessments, and I'm a huge cynic of them. But however, recently I was certified on Berkman, which is the only one I ever have delivered. And actually, I quite like that because it's an attributes test. It's not a psychometric test. But I remember doing what we have in the UK called a Birkbeck test, the Birkbeck College of Tests, when I was 13 to assess your IQ, and I was going to be a lawyer or a dustman. Or I think that was my two choices. I'm not sure where they connected. I got one right. But I think there's we've got Myers-Briggs as well, which is probably one of the best known. You've got DISC, which is, but I think there's a lot of skepticism around assessments. It's like, is this just for the employer to determine whether I'm in or out, or how true and congruent is it with actually who I am? I think that's one of the struggles in creating a test, isn't it? To actually get that engagement from the candidate to say, actually, I think that is an accurate depiction of me. I've actually learned something about myself, as opposed to you just now have a piece of paper telling me if I do this, if you want to get rid of me, then just put me down this path. That's the best way to get rid of me. There is that skepticism there.
I think that's right. And so part of the advance of game-based assessments is kind of overcoming that skepticism, right? Trying to measure these same sort of constructs we're after, things like problem solving, critical thinking, emotional intelligence, through more engaging ways, right? And there's also, in the US at least, there's also the sort of risk perspective that employers have. I think some employers are reticent about providing feedback on assessments because they're also not providing feedback on any other part of the process, right? So it's like if you submit a resume and you take an assessment and then you do an interview and then you eventually get, let's say, a no, they're not giving you your grades on all the other segments of it, right? They're not giving you, you're saying you actually had 5 spelling mistakes on your resume, so that's why we didn't, And so people tend to fixate on the feedback they get. But I think, to your question, Ed, there's a way to write the feedback and to construct it in a way that's very positive, very informative, and hopefully spurs some introspection on the part of the candidate about, oh, this is what they learned about me. What do I think about that? Do I think it's true or not? Maybe there's some areas I can work on. There's some other strengths that I didn't know I had that were pointed out. So I think on balance, it's a very positive thing to give feedback when you can.
Yeah. And I think also we can encourage candidates to say, well, if you've got a criteria or Revelian or one of your applications assessment, you can actually walk into your next interview and say, I've done this one, and this is what it said about me. And I agree with 90% of it. I don't agree with 10% of it, because that's okay. Mm-hmm. But I actually think that's a powerful statement to say, I have been assessed and this is what it said. Yours might be different, but I've learned this about me. So when you ask me about X, this is what I believe. And actually the assessment says that's true. I think you can leverage that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the classic interview questions, right? What are your strengths and weaknesses? And
here it is, right? I've already got it.
Exactly.
Yeah, and look, to get that outcome though, you've got to have the candidate right from the start of the experience buy into the process and believe that this is a fair evaluation. So for me, the candidate engagement piece starts right from the invitation, how they're invited to do the assessment, their experience to come through and complete it in real time. And this is part of what led to the innovation of game-based assessments, is that when they start doing the assessment itself, it has to be a positive experience. It can't be filled with intimidation and nerves and anxiety and fear, because no matter what your outcome is after that experience, it's going to be tarnished a little bit. So the whole notion of a game-based assessment is that we have color, we have images, we have less text-dependent questions, and it's far more interaction in the actual completion of it. And they're getting a real-time loop of feedback as they go to get some sense of how they're tracking. And that experience is so markedly different. We've had a lot of candidates come back to us and say, I actually forgot I was doing an assessment. We've had other candidates come back and say, can I do it again just for fun? And that's when you've really tapped into, you've gone from an intimidating test to now I'm engaged with doing something that's actually fun.
Yeah. And, if it's not what the employer wants, so be it. But at least it was entertainment for them. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things which I think is not creeping in more, but it's very prevalent in organizations where employees have been there for a long period of time. That may change now anyway, because the average length of engagement is 3 years or less now. So we're not necessarily seeing that. But what we're seeing is learned and adaptive behavior. So where someone goes in there with a particular EI pattern and they come out 10 years later and it's changed. And it's changed because they have learned to create and adapt their own behavior to be successful in that environment, but it's not natural to them. And so what you're seeing is, Josh could think, this is what I want from you, Cherie, and behave in an entirely different way. And then there's friction because how the way you see him behave is how you think he wants you to behave to him. So we get this friction between your natural behavior and the behavior of how you are successful. And so I call that adaptive or learned behavior. So how do we assess that and understand here we have a very capable person, but what we know is that there is this lack of congruency between these two, what people see and what I expect. Can you assess that? And can you unpack it? Because I can do that one-on-one, but if there's a tool to do that, it's quite interesting.
Yeah, one of our assessments does measure exactly that. So it looks at what's your innate natural behavioural or personality and preferences, and when you're most at comfort at home or in a context you're really familiar with, how do you react by default versus how are you modifying or adapting your behaviour in the work context based on what you think you're supposed to be doing to achieve whatever outcome. So we can absolutely measure those things, and that's more personality and behaviour. Emotional intelligence, though, is a slightly different construct, and the way that we're measuring that, it's actually an ability-based measure of emotional intelligence. So it's not something that you can adapt as much. It's far more innate in who we are. We can learn strategies and we can develop it over time for sure, but it's not as marked adjustment as what you could see in someone moving their behaviour or personality. And that's one of the really important things when we're thinking about what do we assess in recruitment to make shortlisting or firm decisions rather than just a final preference between qualified candidates. There's using a tool that's ability-based is critical rather than a preference or a behavior-based for shortlisting, because you're saying this is actually something that's a firm predictor of future job performance. When you talk about personality or behavior, we have multiple profiles that could still do a job equally well, just in a different way. So it's not as firm a yes, no in terms of a selection process.
And of course,
I would say to that assessments are kind of fundamentally different than most of the other sort of selection criteria we normally use, in that they are, by their nature, forward-looking, right? They're looking at, especially in these types of assessments that Cherie's mentioning, that are ability-based, they're looking at long-term potential, right? Especially when, in that example of testing grads, most of the things we measure people by when we're trying to decide whether to hire them are fundamentally backward-looking, right? A resume is a list of all the things you've done in the past, right? Most interviews focus on your past experience. Well, tell me, walk me through your resume and tell me what you did in that role. And that's well and good, but we know that experience doesn't predict outcomes. It's certainly like quantity of experience doesn't predict outcomes as much as potential and ability does. Now, there's certainly exceptions, right? You don't want to hire a brain surgeon or an employment lawyer or whatever that doesn't have any experience. So in highly specialized fields, certainly experiences.
It has happened, believe it or not.
Right? You want to be careful in certain situations, but for the vast majority of positions that companies hire for, everything from sales to customer service to even something like software engineering, really what we should be focused on is long-term potential and ability to grow. And that's what assessments can give you a window into the future, rather than just a list of past experiences.
And I know we touched on this before we went live, but something I just wanted to throw in here is the world of neuroscience and how that is being fed into all the data and research that's being done into assessments, recruitment, technology. And one of the things which is the only thing that when I say the only thing, the foremost thing that I coach with everyone is I see so many men and women in the professional corporate world and outside as well, who have only been told that their value base is what their prefrontal cortex is, their executive function, is logic brain. I call it logic brain, strategy analysis, everything that happens up here. But as a human being, as an employee, we need them to understand intuition. We need to engage with everything they have, bring the whole human experience to work. And where we're seeing stress and burnout and poor decision making is because there's an over dependence on logic brain to solve every problem they have, and a lack of understanding of how we use things like intuition and emotion to solve problems. So how do we change that dynamic? Because I think it's one of the most damaging dynamics we've created in the last 100 years of workforces.
Yeah, I think that's where emotional intelligence comes in, right? It's a great introduction to emotional intelligence, right? And when we're talking about cognitive neuroscience, there's also, of course, a cognitive neuropsych basis for emotional intelligence, right? But it's a different part of your brain, right? It's the insular cortex rather than the prefrontal. Yeah. So also rooted in hard science, right? In cognitive neuroscience. But just hard horsepower, intellectual horsepower will only get you so far, right? And it's not universally applicable, is what we know about emotional intelligence. There's roles in which having high emotional intelligence can be not helpful at all, or even sometimes a detriment, right? But in certain roles that are very interaction driven, so things like managerial roles where you're managing people, or sales, or customer service sometimes, or counseling, right? Those are roles in which EI can sometimes be just as important as the more traditional ways of measuring intelligence, or even more important. And so it's discovering like those roles and assessing people for those roles with EI that's such an exciting area for us, because you're going beyond what you said, just pure sort of problem solving and logic.
I think you're also, and this is maybe for you, Cherie, because your background in psychology, is what we're doing is we are predicting where we have a higher extreme rate of burnout. So we can say, okay, well, we've got this executive who is performing at an incredibly high level, but what we know is that they're only performing very well at work and their function is off the charts, but within a time frame, that's going to start derailing and fragmenting. We need to know that on day one, because we've got to manage that and then adapt that and help them, coach them through that, so they can still be a very effective member of our workforce. But we don't want them falling apart when they're here, for their own mental and physical health, but also for our own business. So where's that coming in? Because I think it's such an important part that we look after our people, not just use them as an asset to get a result, because that to me is, we just can't go down that path anymore.
No, that's exactly right. And I think that is really at the heart of why emotional intelligence is such a core topic right now for recruitment and development of people and future leaders and beyond. Because what emotional intelligence really is in the workplace is how well we perceive, understand, and manage emotions. And we know people with higher levels of emotional intelligence are more likely to engage better in terms of interactions and relationships with their co-workers. They're more likely to sit and effectively work within team dynamics and actually contribute more positively to broader organizational culture. And all of those things lead to higher degrees of well-being, higher degrees of engagement, more positive experience. So we understand now that this 20, 30 years ago, we expected a really firm segmentation, park your emotions at the door and then turn up like a robot and just do your job. We understand it's the opposite. You actually need to understand how to appropriately enmesh your emotions and use emotions appropriately and effectively at work to the benefit of an outcome. And we see now, because that science and that data is really established, that organizations are measuring emotional intelligence at the front door of their business to find people from day one who come into their organizations, not only at top level, C-suite, but even graduates, because they are the future leaders over time. And as Josh mentioned, in any role that engages more with others, individually within a team and customer service, it's probably number one or two in terms of the greatest predictor of performance for those core roles. So emotional intelligence is seeing a reduction in stress, improvements in well-being, reduction in turnover because of all of those factors, and overall enhanced performance at an individual and an organizational level.
And as we wrap up, a couple of final questions, but I'm just curious to know for Josh and Cherie here, do these organizations invite you back in and say, okay, well, if we're doing, say, interventions or at executive level, say what we want to do is we know where they were at. Like, we've got their markers on day one, but we want to know what their markers are in year 2 and year 3 and 4. Because if they're beginning to change, as we say, with stress and overwork, those markers are going to change dramatically and quite quickly. Do they invite you back in and say, no, we want you to do a reassessment, not to see whether they should keep their job or not, but to see how we manage their mental health and how we manage their stress levels and load and everything else?
I will say in the US, we've been, and I think this is the same for Revelians, historically, we've been more focused on helping with that upfront decision of hiring. But we're also excited because this year we're moving beyond that into, you mentioned like the Myers-Briggs and the DISC earlier on. There's a huge role for assessments to play post-hire as well, more from a growth and development standpoint and teaming and collaboration and all those things. And those things are really coming to the fore in the COVID environment as well, because if there's challenges to in-person teams, I think the challenge with remote teams is even greater. So we are expanding into that area, but haven't done too much of it historically. So,
but that's exciting, right?
It is exciting. Yeah, we're very excited about it. So, check back in 6 months, and we'll have some learnings for you.
Okay, brilliant. Look, as we wrap up, first of all, where can everyone find you, and any final message you'd like to share?
Great. Yeah. Well, you can find me personally on LinkedIn, and if you want to learn more about Criteria's services, you can do that at criteriacorp.com. And I'll let Cherie tell you about Revelian.
Absolutely. So likewise on LinkedIn, both Josh and I are pretty active on there. So happy to engage with extended conversation at any time. And Revelian.com, we've got lots of information on there. More to see in the coming months as Revelian and Criteria start to leverage even more of the value that we share. So looking forward to what lies ahead.
Yeah, so that's Josh Millett on LinkedIn and Cherie Curtis, and that will be in the show notes. All the links will be in there as well. Any final message from either of you?
Oh, just thanks so much for having us on, Ed. It was a really fun conversation.
No, my pleasure. And thank you, Josh, and thank you, Cherie. That was great fun. I look forward. Maybe we can check in again when you've got the new project out and see where the world is at.
Sounds great. Look forward to it.
Okay.